If you're just trying to keep everybody out of your property when the shit hits the fan, you might bring more security threats on yourself. The downside of walling yourself off from the world is you can't reap the spoils of what's beyond the barriers. How do you deal with outsiders? Do you deal with them in a way which is diplomatic or more militantly? You're trained to have a certain set of criteria to determine if something is a threat, and if it meets those criteria, you execute. Literally, if you do take the life of somebody out of what you perceive to be a self-defense situation, you're going to breed a lot of resentment and contempt, and that could ultimately be your undoing. So I recently watched a screening of the movie Homestead. We're going to be having the director on the channel, and I'm going to be doing an in-depth review of the movie because I think it's very pertinent to preparedness and the concepts that we discuss on this channel. But I want to just share some general thoughts about kind of the main plot and some of the primary dynamics and conflicts that arise between the various characters. Essentially, the plot is that there's this family who is fairly well-to-do, and they are preppers. They have a lot of resources at their disposal. They also have a security team at their disposal. And as you can appreciate, conflicts begin to arise between the owner of the property and the security team. The whole movie is basically about how do you deal with outsiders? Do you deal with them in a way which is diplomatic, or do you approach outsiders more militantly? This is a recurring trope, but this movie, I think, provides some unique insights. When you're making a movie like this, the director, the producers, they have to make something, they have to consult with a lot of experts and develop a storyline that is plausible. So for that reason, this gives a lot of food for thought. So you have a situation where you have a very wealthy prepper guy, and he has this compound with a lot of people in it. And there's a lot of people who want to get into this compound, and he hires a private security group in order to basically police and ensure that the compound is not overrun. If you're somebody who has no preparedness inclination whatsoever, the first thing you're going to notice about this movie is that indeed there's poor people trying to get in to a rich person's compound. For a person who maybe thinks about these things and is more preparedness minded, you're probably going to notice the dynamic of how does the owner of a property maintain control, not just of what's going on beyond the gates, but what's going on within their own gates. The next level of insight is going to be that the mercenaries need to be kept in line somehow, right? And the thinking is going to be that you can't trust a merc, you can't trust an ex-special forces, you can't trust private security, because inevitably they're probably going to try to overthrow you. Another way of looking at it is that an operator wants to operate. A military guy wants to do military stuff. He wants to be tasked with an objective or a mission, and he is most comfortable when taking orders, which is contrary to a lot of the plots and a lot of the thinking that suggests that they're just going to ultimately become military dictators, they're going to overthrow the leaders. You got to understand, military men, and this is not a disparaging remark to say that they are accustomed to taking orders. And in fact, that's an environment that they're going to thrive in most. When they perhaps don't have to oversee policy, they don't have to oversee how the community is run. If security is their thing, they want to be allowed to do security in a way which is going to be unrestrained. The problem is going to arise when that security detail feels restrained, or the strategy of the owner is at odds with the security team. To operators, to ex-military in general, especially when you're out there on the mission, you're trained to have a certain set of criteria to determine if something is a threat. And if it meets those criteria, you execute, literally, in most cases. So there's not a lot of leeway for diplomacy in that case. But what this movie highlights is that there's an importance to having that diplomacy. It really does a good job of showcasing the contention between people who want to protect the people inside and the more long-term strategy of having a good relationship with the surrounding community. Because if you're just trying to keep everybody out of your property when the shit hits the fan, and you are completely severing ties with the outside world, you might bring more security threats on yourself. I mean, the conventional thinking is that don't give people any handouts because they're going to keep coming back and they're going to keep wanting more. In the film, the security forces view every person on the outside as being a threat, whereas the owner of the property doesn't necessarily view everybody as threats, but he's torn between exercising his humanity and sharing with the outside, or allowing these security guys to dictate, who comes in and out of the gates. And so you have a situation where you have a lot of people, the townsfolk, everybody banging on this rich guy's door for stuff, and the security team is taking the approach of everybody's a threat. On the one hand, that's a respectable position. You have to have those boundaries. On the other hand, there's an argument made within this movie that I've made on numerous occasions that, human beings are a resource. And I think oftentimes this is something that is overlooked. The majority of people, I think, are willing to integrate, especially if you have a robust socio-political structure in that community and there's rules. Most people are not criminals. However, and this is where some people said I've contradicted myself in the past, the people that you want inside your community should be people with family. People with children are either your biggest asset or your biggest threat. I've run into problems in the past where I've said, you got to watch out for people with kids because they can kind of be the wolf in sheep's clothing because they're willing to do whatever it takes to survive, even if it means stealing, possibly even killing you for your stuff. And that is true. But on the other hand, I've also said that those are the people you want in your community. So both of those things can be true. I would venture to say that one of the most ideal solutions is what they portrayed in this movie, is that you have a guy who's in charge of security detail who has military experience, but he also has his family living inside your compound. That gives him a vested interest in not just maintaining security, but also he understands that, he wants his kids to have a future, so he wants some cohesive society for them to flourish in. You need people like that. You absolutely do, especially when the government comes and they want to expropriate your stuff. If you have lone wolves who are behind the gun, you run into problems because they don't have that same vested interest. What I got from this film, and I think it's an excellent point, if anything, if that's all you get from this film, is that if you have people that you trust to do security detail, understand that they're probably going to have families, most of them, and you're going to want to make their families a part of that process, because that's going to prevent them from wanting to overthrow you. Because remember, a grunt wants to grunt, an operator wants to operate. And if they have any foresight whatsoever, they're going to realize that a military dictatorship is not going to have as much staying power, because the guy in charge shouldn't be the one holding a gun, but he should be in charge. If the guy in charge is holding a gun, people are going to start to feel oppressed. So you have to have a really strong communal bond with your people. The question is, and I think this is what the movie really excelled at, was how do you resolve the disputes between those two groups? Because the military guys are going to perceive everything as a threat, whereas the political class or the owners of the property are not going to be as standoffish. Again, the downside of walling yourself off from the world is you can't reap the spoils of what's beyond the barriers. Having the political class acknowledge things from the perspective of the military class and say, okay, we acknowledge that there are threats that exist, but at the same time, you have to have the military class understand the benefits of the strategy of not being isolationist. Short to mid-term, that strategy is going to work. In the long term, it's not going to work. This happens relatively early in the movie, so I don't think it's a major spoiler, but if you are really worried about spoilers, maybe stop the video here. There's an open perimeter, it's not fenced, And it's kind of like a back 40 type situation where the guy's property is backed onto government land. In peacetime, anybody has a legal right to access that land for recreational purposes. The security team doesn't want anybody back in this region, even though they technically have a legal right to be there, and the owner supports their legal right to be there. So the owner is saying, well, I have no authority to push these people off their property, whereas the security team's argument is that a sniper would have a line of sight from this public land that looks into our property. So we need to make sure that nobody comes onto this public land. And so this is where the problems arise. If you do take the life of somebody out of what you perceive to be a self-defense situation, having to deal with the legal repercussions is going to be a nail biter. There's not going to be any clear-cut answers. In most countries, there has to be a clear and present danger before you can use lethal force on anybody. Obviously, in Canada, our laws are incredibly strict with respect to that. But in the United States, in some states, not all, it's going to vary from state to state. I have to be careful what I say here. But the Castle Doctrine gives a bit more leeway to the owner of that property to utilize lethal force on a trespasser. You can't see it one-dimensionally as, oh, this guy's trespassing on my property, so I'm going to shoot him. Okay, well, what happens when his family comes looking for him? You're going to breed a lot of resentment and contempt in that way, and that could ultimately be your undoing. But go and watch the movie. We're going to have the director on. I'm going to do an in-depth review prior to that, a scene-by-scene breakdown, because I think there's a lot to be gleaned. Even though it is fiction, there's a lot to learn. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Canadian Prepper out.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.